December 21st, 1942, North Atlantic, 0300 hours. A wall of sleet moved over the convoy like a curtain of steel needles. The horizon had vanished hours ago. Only the hiss of the wind and the low heartbeat of engines remained. On the bridge of the Liberty ship SS Robert E. Lee, Chief Mate Edward Miller leaned over the chart table, a pencil trembling in his glove. Frost crusted the compass glass. Somewhere off the port beam, another ship's running lights flashed once, twice, then disappeared behind a wave the size of a warehouse. Below deck, steam hissed through pipes that groaned like the ribs of a living thing. The men could feel the Atlantic pressing against every plate of steel. Each time the hull slammed down, cups rattled, bolts screamed, and someone muttered a prayer. They were carrying 10,000 tons of cargo, munitions, food, fuel, packed so tight the deck barely rose above the sea. Edward Miller checked his watch. 300 hours. Convoy, NS 154, was crawling toward Britain at 8 knots, barely faster than a man could run. They had already lost 2 ships in the fog the night before, torpedoes finding their mark with a muffled thud that rolled across the water. The men didn't talk about it, they just waited for the next one. Beneath that same ocean, 30 meters down, another crew waited too. Inside a German Type 7 U-boat, diesel fumes clung to the air as the periscope rose through the waves. The commander, Kapitän-Leutnant Hans Schaefer, stared through the lens at the faint silhouettes above. His lips curled. "Another Liberty," he whispered. "Slow, ugly, dead already." His first officer laughed. They all laughed. They had good reason to. For 3 years, German U-boats had ruled these waters. The Kriegsmarine called it the Tonnenkrieg, the war of tonnage. Every month they sank more shipping than the Allies could replace. Britain's imports were cut in half. Grain, oil, iron, even mail. Everything that fed the island came by sea, and the sea had turned against them. The German Admiralty measured success in numbers, not battles. If they could sink more than 700,000 tons of Allied cargo per month, the enemy would collapse without an invasion. It was mathematics, pure and merciless, and the math was working. Berlin's newspapers boasted of the U-Boot-Waffe, the silent hunters who had brought an empire to its knees. Posters showed wolves encircling a convoy, red eyes glowing in black seas. Radio Berlin broadcast triumph after triumph. England starves while America trembles, one announcer declared. So when intelligence reports spoke of a new American freighter appearing by the hundreds, the reaction was laughter. Photographs showed a squat hull, a single funnel, a stern gun that looked more like an afterthought. The Germans called it the Kiste, the box. Some officers said the Americans were building them from scrap. Others claimed they were made of concrete. Admiral Dönitz dismissed the design entirely. "They build coffins," he told his staff. "We provide the funerals." But across the Atlantic, something very different was happening. In the shipyards of Baltimore, Richmond, and Portland, night never truly fell. Floodlights turned the docks into blazing islands of steel. Sparks cascaded from scaffolds. Cranes moved like giants above skeletons of half-built hulls. The air smelled of welding smoke and coffee. Voices echoed, men shouting measurements, women hauling rivet buckets, foremen barking orders through megaphones. Each slipway looked identical because every ship was identical. The Liberty ship wasn't built to be admired. It was built to be copied. Instead of bespoke craftsmanship, the United States Maritime Commission demanded standardization. Every beam, every engine, every bolt interchangeable. Where a British or German yard needed 250 days to launch one cargo ship, Henry J. Kaiser's workers would soon do it in 40, then 30, then 20. At his West Coast yards, entire hulls slid into the sea before the paint on their predecessors had dried. In Washington, critics sneered. The Liberty ship, they said, was a cheap answer to a complicated problem, a floating box powered by a 19th century steam engine. Naval officers called it an insult to the art of shipbuilding. Even Roosevelt's advisors doubted the program's sanity, but the president didn't flinch. "We are going to build them," he said, "until the enemy stops laughing." The enemy kept laughing. German commanders believed American industry couldn't possibly keep pace. Steel shortages, labor strikes, fuel rationing. They predicted chaos. One propaganda pamphlet declared, "For every ship they launch, we sink 2, And for a time, that was true. In 1942 alone, U-boats sent 1,160 Allied vessels to the bottom, nearly 8 million tons of shipping. Merchant sailors called it the Black Year. Convoys lost ships faster than codebreakers could rename them. But the Liberty program was just beginning. By December of that year, the same month Robert E. Lee steamed through the storm, 20 American yards had already launched more than 600 ships. Donitz's reports began to show an unfamiliar curve. Allied losses steady, Allied production rising. The tonnage war was shifting from destruction to creation. Still, the Germans couldn't see it yet. From the periscope, Schaefer watched as another Liberty ship crossed the lens. He saw no speed, no power, nothing to fear. He didn't know that behind that one hull were hundreds more already waiting in line. On that frozen night, when he ordered the torpedo fired, he believed he was striking at the heart of Allied logistics. What he really hit was a single cell in an organism that could not die. The Liberty ship was not a ship, it was a system, and the system was awakening. When dawn came, the sea looked like a shattered mirror. Oil slicks drifted across the surface, rainbow-coloured under the grey light. The Robert E. Lee was gone. Her final SOS had crackled for less than a minute before silence swallowed the frequency. In the submarine below, Hans Schaefer allowed himself a rare smile. Another victory. Another line on the tonnage chart that would hang in Berlin by month's end. His men cheered, passing around a single cigarette. Above them, crates of canned peaches and machine parts floated in the wreckage. Schaefer thought nothing of it. To him, the ship was just another number, 10,000 tons erased. But he was wrong. For every Liberty ship the Germans sank, 3 more were already sliding into the water somewhere in America. The first signs of the contradiction appeared quietly, buried in reports no one wanted to believe. Convoys that should have vanished kept arriving. Dockmasters in Liverpool noticed that even as losses continued, new ships were filling their berths faster than they could unload them. At first, the British Admiralty assumed the Americans had found a way to hide true losses, maybe through censorship, but the numbers didn't lie. By the spring of 1943, more than 1,000 Liberty ships had been completed. The Atlantic, once an open graveyard, was beginning to crowd again. From the air, Allied reconnaissance pilots saw something that defied logic. Convoys so large they seemed to merge into one continuous scar across the sea. Ships as far as the eye could see, plodding west to east in endless formation. Like factories moving through water, one observer wrote. That image wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was the truth. The Liberty program had transformed the concept of shipbuilding itself. Each vessel used the same 250,000 parts, all mass-produced in standardized shapes. Parts were made inland, engines from Detroit, valves from Ohio, propellers from Pennsylvania, then shipped by rail to coastal yards. The shipyards didn't build ships, they assembled them, like toys. Even the unskilled could contribute. A farmer from Kansas could spend a month learning to weld and then join the front lines of production. At peak output, Kaiser's Richmond yard alone launched a new Liberty ship every 72 hours. The Germans didn't believe the reports. When the British Broadcasting Service claimed America had built over 2,000 cargo ships in 18 months, German propagandists called it absurd. It is impossible, one naval analyst wrote. Such fabrication violates industrial logic. But the logic had changed. While the Reich invested in elite craftsmanship, custom U-boats, precision optics, hand-forged torpedoes, the United States invested in repetition. Machines replaced artisans, efficiency replaced prestige. The Americans weren't chasing perfection, they were chasing saturation, and that difference would rewrite the war. The contradiction became impossible to ignore by mid-1943. In the Bay of Biscay, U-boats returned to port empty-handed. Convoys that should have been easy targets now travelled under a web of escort ships and aircraft. Liberty ships carried their own deck guns and anti-air batteries. What had been slow prey had learned to bite back. In one report to Berlin, Schaefer described a convoy protected by a fortress of steel. He counted nearly 100 merchant ships and more than 20 warships surrounding them. Every time his periscope broke the surface, it was met by radar. He began to wonder aloud if the ocean itself had changed sides. By then, the Allies had cracked the Enigma code. Every U-boat transmission was being read within hours. What the Germans didn't realize was that even when they found a target, replacements were already on the way. The factories never slept. In Richmond, night shifts blurred into day. Children delivered food to the yards, too young to work but unwilling to stay home. At dusk, whistles blew, and a new shift took over before the old one had even clocked out. The rhythm was mechanical, hypnotic, unstoppable. For every ton of steel Germany sank, America laid down 2. Schaefer's next patrol lasted only 3 weeks before he was ordered to return home. His boat, U-438, had scored 2 kills but lost half its crew to depth charges. As he limped back toward the French coast, he noticed something strange on the horizon, smoke trails that didn't end. Convoys stretched from horizon to horizon. He wrote in his log, "The sea is full of ghosts. We kill them and they return." That line would later be found among the wreckage of his submarine, which never made it back to port. By June, even Dönitz could see the shift. The admiral who once promised to choke the Atlantic admitted in private that his fleet was losing the numbers war. He called it der Wendepunkt, the turning point, but his pride would not let him say it publicly. Instead, he ordered larger wolf packs, more aggression, and more risk. Tea didn't matter. The Liberty ships kept coming. Back in America, Kaiser's engineers began experimenting with modular design. They pre-assembled deck houses, boiler rooms, and bridge sections, stacking them like building blocks ready for the next hull. Some sections were welded miles away and shipped by train to meet the rest. Each innovation shaved hours, sometimes days, off the schedule, and every saved hour meant another ship on the water. Liberty ship number 1500 was christened with the swing of a champagne bottle and the applause of dock workers. Photographs of the launch reached Berlin within days. One caption read, "Built in 19 days." German engineers laughed again. They called it wasteful, but that laughter had a nervous edge now. In less than 2 years, America had mastered what Germany thought impossible, the industrialization of speed itself. The contradiction was no longer hidden. It was sailing across every ocean. By the summer of 1943, the numbers had become their own battlefield. Every morning, Allied Command posted new tonnage reports, rows of figures that looked almost abstract. But behind every digit was steel, labour, and lives. Shipyards across the United States reported launches like a heartbeat. One at Richmond before dawn, another at Portland by midday, a third from Bethlehem Fairfield as the night shift ended. The radio crackled constantly with the same words, "Another one afloat." The numbers defied belief. In May alone, 85 new Liberty ships entered service. June 100, July 123. A ship a day had become a ship every 12 hours. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence tried to keep up. Their analysts filled charts with blue ink, counting losses, estimating production, and recalculating capacity. But the lines refused to meet. Each month the Allied curve climbed while the German one sank. To Dönitz, who had built his empire on arithmetic, the new data looked like betrayal. He called in his staff. "We must be mistaken," he said. "No country can build ships that fast." But America could, because America had redefined what building meant. Traditional shipbuilding had been an art. Now it was a formula. The Kaiser yards divided every hull into 72 prefabricated sections, each produced by separate teams who never saw the final ship. The welders didn't know the machinists didn't know the painters, yet every bolt lined up, every plate fit perfectly. A single Liberty required 500,000 individual parts. At first, assembling them took over 200 days. By mid-1943 it took 35. By late 1944 some were built in less than 2 weeks. The Robert E. Peary, completed in 4 days and 15 hours, became legend. Its launch was broadcast nationwide, a symphony of speed. Crowds lined the harbour as welders still wearing gloves from the final shift watched their work slide into the water. Newspapers called it America's answer to the Wolfpacks. In Germany, the propaganda ministry dismissed it as lies. But deep inside the naval archives, intelligence officers noted a terrifying phrase, production approaching infinity. The U-boats could sink 20 ships a month. America could replace 60. The scale rippled outward. Those grey silhouettes carried the war's blood supply, fuel, food, weapons, entire railways. Each one bore enough cargo to equip a division for a month. The statistics were brutal and elegant at once. Over 2,700 Liberty ships built in total. 6,000 miles of pipeline laid to feed them fuel. 18 million tons of cargo capacity afloat by 1944. What had begun as improvisation was now empire. Every convoy that crossed the Atlantic carried within it the logic of inevitability. U-boats struck, torpedoes hit, ships burned, and the equation stayed unchanged. 1 down, 3 up. In August 1943, British merchant officers reported something strange. They no longer recognised half the hulls arriving in port. The registry books couldn't keep pace. The same name appeared twice, sometimes 3 times, attached to different ships built faster than paperwork could track them. "Their numbers don't end," a German signals officer wrote in his diary. "Every attack feels smaller." Inside the control rooms of the U-boat pens at Lorient, Brest and Saint-Nazaire, radio chatter filled the concrete tunnels. Reports came in of submarines running out of fuel, of convoys defended by aircraft that should have been miles beyond range. The Liberty fleet carried not only cargo but fuel for the planes that hunted their hunters. Logistics had become strategy. Admiral King in Washington called it the Second Front, not fought with rifles but with cranes and schedules. Every shipyard was a battlefield, every welder a soldier. The casualty list was measured not in deaths but in hours lost. The mathematics grew surreal. In the first quarter of 1943, Germany built 56 submarines. In that same period, America launched 400 Liberty ships, 400 floating fortresses against 56 wolves, and each one mattered. A Liberty carried 9,000 tons of supplies on average. That meant that by June, the Allies moved more than 3 million tons of material every month. Steel, ammunition, medicine, dreams. Enough to feed an island and arm 2 continents. The imbalance spread like a contagion. In the skies above the Atlantic, long-range bombers hunted the U-boats, guided by radar made possible by components shipped in those same cargo holds. On land, the supplies unloaded from Liberty ships rebuilt railways, refueled factories and paved runways from North Africa to Normandy. Every calculation reinforced the same truth. Numbers, when wielded with purpose, became weapons. The German command tried to answer with technology. New U-boat models, the Type 21 and 23, promised greater speed and endurance. They were marvels of engineering decades ahead of their time. But they arrived too late, smothered by the very efficiency they sought to fight. For every prototype launched, 20 Liberty ships were already crossing the Atlantic. Quantity had evolved into quality. By late summer, the convoy system itself had transformed. What began as tight defensive formations became something almost offensive. Columns stretching miles wide, escorted by destroyers, carriers, and aircraft. From above, they looked like industrial rivers flowing eastward. The Germans called them moving cities. And inside those steel cities life persisted. Crews drank bitter coffee, played cards on oil-stained tables, wrote letters home on stationery that smelled of rust. One sailor aboard the SS John W. Brown scribbled in his journal, "The waves beat like hammers, but we keep going. Somewhere out there, someone needs what we carry." It was an ordinary sentence, but it captured the extraordinary secret of the Liberty fleet. Endurance disguised as routine. By autumn 1943, the arithmetic of defeat was written in every German report. Sinkings down by half. Convoy arrivals up by double. The Tonnenkrieg was collapsing under its own numbers. Dönitz still refused to admit it. In his September directive, he ordered his captains to attack with fanatical aggression. Yet within weeks, 32 U-boats were gone, most lost without trace. The war of tonnage had reversed polarity. Now it was Germany running out of time. In the vastness of the Atlantic, every number had a face, every statistic had a heartbeat. The official reports spoke of thousands of ships, millions of tons, but on the rolling decks it came down to a few dozen men and the silence between waves. They were not soldiers. They were merchants, fishermen, factory workers who had traded one uniform for another. Their weapon was the will to keep going. One of them was First Engineer Harold Bixby of the SS William Hooper. In a letter to his wife written on a scrap of ledger paper, he confessed, "We are not brave men, we are necessary men. The war moves through us like blood through a vein. He folded the note, sealed it in wax, and left it with the ship's mail pouch. He never saw it delivered. His ship was torpedoed 2 weeks later off the Azores. But the letter survived, found floating in a waterproof bag, words still legible under salt stains. It became a kind of prayer among merchant sailors, necessary men. They had no flags to plant, no enemy in sight. Their victories were measured in arrival times. A ship that made it to Liverpool was a medal, one that didn't was a ghost. Yet they knew that without their ghosts the front would collapse. At night the convoys seemed almost peaceful. Dozens of ships cutting steady wakes under pale moons, their engines drumming in sync. But everyone knew how quickly that peace could break. A torpedo didn't announce itself. It simply appeared, a white line racing through the dark. When it hit, the shockwave was instant. Lights out, decks buckling, men flung into freezing blackness. In those moments, courage was not grand. It was a hand reaching for another in the dark, a voice shouting names into the wind. Survivors spoke later of how they could hear the Liberty ships dying, the high scream of steam escaping, the deep groan of steel folding in half. Captain James French of the SS. James Egan Lane recalled, "You don't see the explosion. You feel it first in your stomach. Then you hear the sound, and it feels like the ocean itself is cracking open." The Lane went down in March 1945, but her wreck still lies off Plymouth, a silent memorial to the fleet that carried civilization on its back. The Americans called them ugly ducklings. The British called them lifelines. The sailors who served on them called them coffins with engines. Yet even those who cursed the ships respected what they could do. They could take damage and stay afloat, limp into port with half a bow missing, run on one engine for 1,000 miles. They were too simple to die easily. In one convoy, a Liberty took 2 torpedoes to the stern and refused to sink. The crew patched the hole with mattresses and steel plates scavenged from a lifeboat. They limped into port 10 days later, cargo intact. The ship's name was SS Nathaniel Greene. The Germans who had fired the torpedoes sent a radio message afterward. "Respect to the ship that will not drown." Stories like that circulated in canteens and newspapers. They became part of the mythology of the home front. Families clipped photographs from magazines showing their sons beside the hulking grey freighters. The ships were no longer just vessels. They were proof that ordinary work could be extraordinary. In New York, an 8-year-old girl named Carolyn Marks visited the harbour with her father, a dock worker. When she asked him why the ships all look the same, he answered, "Because they're all for the same reason." She wrote those words later in a school essay that was reprinted in Life magazine. "All for the same reason" became a wartime slogan painted on banners above shipyard gates. For the men building them, the Liberty ships were personal. Welders scratched initials into steel plates before they were sealed behind bulkheads. Some hid lucky coins inside welded seams. When one ship launched, a welder named Salvatore Russo climbed the scaffolding to watch it slide into the river. He whispered, "Go feed somebody," as it moved past. Decades later, when interviewed as an old man, he said, "I never saw war, but I built its stomach." The German side had its own human moments too. In a recovered U-boat logbook, an engineer named Otto Lemke wrote, "We no longer hunt ships, we hunt shadows." The ocean is filled with them, endless and silent. It feels as if the sea itself is producing them faster than we can sink them. His entry ended 3 days before his submarine disappeared near Iceland. Even in their victory, the Allies carried grief. Merchant marine casualty rates were among the highest of any service. 1 in every 26 sailors lost, yet the work never stopped. To the Liberty crews, survival wasn't just luck, it was responsibility. Every voyage meant hospitals stocked, armies fed, cities lit again. They called themselves the line that doesn't break. One captain described the feeling of reaching port after weeks of storms and attacks. You tie up, and there's this silence. The cranes start moving, and you realize what you've done. Those crates hold bread, bullets, blankets. You've just carried a city's heartbeat. That was the real front line. Invisible, constant, unglamorous. By winter 1943, the Liberty fleet had grown so vast that individual stories blurred into one another. Ship names read like a roll call of history. Abraham Lincoln, Walt Whitman, Frederick Douglass, George Washington Carver. It was as if a nation's entire past had been launched into the sea to secure its future. When newsreels showed rows of grey hulls sliding into the water, audiences in cinemas didn't cheer the way they did for dogfights or tank battles. They just watched in silence, understanding that this was what endurance looked like. The Liberty ship was not a monument. It was a mirror, reflecting what ordinary people could do when time itself was running out. And as 1944 dawned, that mirror faced Germany. For the first time, even their engineers began to admit it. The enemy had turned factories into strategy, labour into weaponry, faith into freight. By early 1944, something fundamental had shifted beneath the waves. The U-boats were still out there, but the hunters had become the hunted. Convoy HX-280 left Halifax that January with 65 merchant ships, most of them Liberty class. They steamed through snow and sleet under the constant whine of radar sweeps. Above them, Liberator bombers traced wide circles, their engines droning like mechanical angels. When a U-boat surfaced 12 miles off the convoy's flank, it was spotted within seconds. A destroyer peeled away, sonar echoing through the water like a heartbeat. Within minutes the sea erupted, depth charges thundering in rhythm, geysers of foam rising like pillars of judgment. When the water settled, oil and debris floated where a predator had been. For the first time, entire wolf packs were being wiped out before they could even attack. The Atlantic, once Germany's silent weapon, had become their grave. And it wasn't just military might that turned the tide, it was momentum. In Washington, planners realized they could not only replace ships, but anticipate losses before they happened. Algorithms, hand-calculated on chalkboards by women at the Maritime Commission, predicted attrition rates and preemptively scheduled replacements. It meant that every time a ship sank, its successor was already halfway built. The Germans never had a chance to catch up. On February 16th, 1944, Dönitz received a report he didn't want to read. In 1 month, his fleet had lost 43 submarines. That was nearly a quarter of his active force. The Atlantic, he admitted privately, was untenable. But what broke him wasn't just the losses. It was the message encoded within the losses, the realization that technology had been defeated by quantity, precision overwhelmed by persistence. The wolf had outsmarted itself. When the U-boat U-505 was captured intact by the Americans that same year, its logbooks revealed a chilling confession. One entry read, "We have seen the horizon filled with ships. There is no end. For every one we strike, 5 appear. The ocean breeds them." The Allies broadcast that line across every naval station. It became a symbol of something deeper than victory. Inevitability. Liberty ships were no longer the butt of German jokes. They were a force of nature. From the coast of Newfoundland to Gibraltar, convoys passed like migrating cities. Radar blips overlapped. Escorts didn't bother naming every ship anymore. They simply referred to them by columns and numbers. Red 3, blue 6, white 11. Each one carried more than cargo, and carried proof that Hitler's war machine could be outbuilt. It wasn't elegant, but it was absolute. By spring, the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest continuous campaign of the war, was effectively over. The U-boat arm, once Germany's pride, was collapsing faster than it could rebuild. Dönitz wrote bitterly in his diary, "Our boats now sink in sight of the coast they can no longer reach." That same month, the SS James W. Nesmith limped into Liverpool, her hull blackened by fire, decks shattered from torpedo impact. Her captain, Albert Macaulay, had refused to abandon ship. He wrote in his after-action report, "We were told she would not make it." But I looked at her, and I thought, she's not built to quit. The ship was patched, repainted, and sent back out 3 weeks later. Stories like that spread through Allied command as proof of something no chart could show. Resilience measured not in steel but in spirit. The Liberty ships had turned from tools into symbols, from cargo vessels into metaphors. In Berlin, the mood darkened. Even Goebbels, master of propaganda, struggled to explain the collapse. His speeches grew abstract. He blamed the weather, Allied espionage, fate. But deep down, everyone knew what had happened. The Reich had gambled on speed, on fear, on the idea that precision could terrify the world into submission. But precision had met its match in persistence. The Americans built Liberty ships the way time builds history, continuously, indifferently, unrelentingly. It wasn't that the Allies had better ships or better sailors. It was that they had more of everything: ships, welders, hours, faith. The Liberty fleet was less a navy than a manifestation of belief that the sum of small efforts, multiplied endlessly, could become destiny. When Dönitz finally ordered the withdrawal of U-boats from the North Atlantic in May 1944, it was the quietest surrender of the war. No ceremony, no white flags, no speeches, just an acknowledgement that the sea no longer belonged to Germany. The Liberty ships had taken it. And what's remarkable is that they did it without trying to be remarkable. They were, by every measure, average. Average speed, average design, average weaponry. But in their sheer ordinariness lay their power, because the war had never been about perfection. It was about pressure. Who could apply it longer, harder, more relentlessly? And by that measure, the Liberty fleet was invincible. That realization spread through every convoy, every dock, every factory. Welders began painting messages inside the hulls before launch. Take it to Berlin. Feed the boys. Make it count. Each ship carried thousands of such invisible notes. Words never meant to be read, but felt. That was the turning point, when machinery became meaningful. By the summer of 1944, the Atlantic had gone silent. Not the silence of defeat, but of dominion. Convoys moved now without fear. Radio chatter replaced distress calls. The black waves that had once hidden predators now shimmered under the lights of endless hulls. The sea lanes, once ruled by U-boats, had become highways of deliverance. From the air, reconnaissance pilots described the view as surreal. You can walk from America to Europe on their decks, one wrote. It wasn't far from the truth. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had raged for nearly 6 years, was over. Yet few noticed its ending. There was no headline, no grand declaration, only a gradual shift in rhythm, cargo arriving faster, supply lines never breaking, fuel tanks never emptying. Victory had crept in quietly, disguised as routine. In London, Churchill called the merchant fleet the golden chain of destiny. In Washington, Roosevelt described the Liberty program as a monument not of marble, but of movement. But for the sailors, it was simpler. They just called it survival. One captain, Raymond Stevens of the SS Thomas Donaldson, wrote in his final war log, "We have crossed this ocean enough to know its moods, its hunger, its mercy. It took many of us, but it gave us purpose. That purpose was now visible everywhere. The supplies pouring across the Atlantic built the staging grounds for Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Every tank, every rifle, every ration tin had likely spent weeks in a Liberty ship's hold. When Allied soldiers stormed the beaches on June 6, 1944, they were standing on a foundation of steel carried across the sea by those grey, unglamorous giants. On D-Day alone, more than 4,000 Liberty and Victory ships supported the invasion fleet. Some carried ammunition, others fuel, others food. And even as shells exploded on the horizon, more convoys were already sailing, carrying replacements, reinforcements, the next heartbeat of the campaign. Behind the front lines, the logistical miracle unfolded with mechanical precision. In ports from Southampton to Cherbourg, cranes unloaded cargo night and day. Fuel lines ran directly from Liberty holds into depots and airfields. Soldiers joked that they could smell America in the air, the tang of coffee, gasoline, and fresh paint. In one dockside letter, a British worker wrote, "We used to dread the telegram saying what was lost. Now we count what has arrived. The sea feels friendly again. For the Germans, it was the opposite. Their ports, once bustling with submarines, fell eerily still. The pens at Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, and La Rochelle became mausoleums of steel. Submarines sat idle, engines silent, crews hollow-eyed. Some officers refused to sail again. Others took their boats out one last time, disappearing beneath the waves they once ruled. Even the propaganda dried up. No more headlines about wolves of the Atlantic, only silence and denial. In the ruins of Hamburg, an engineer named Friedrich Keller recorded in his post-war notes, "We were defeated not by men, but by factories. The Americans built faster than we could think. It wasn't arrogance that had doomed them. It was the assumption that quality alone could win a war. The Liberty ship shattered that illusion. Germany had built masterpieces, U-boats of sleek design, engines handcrafted to perfection, optics polished until flawless. But in war, perfection is fragile. A single bomb, a single delay, a single crack in supply, and perfection dies. The Liberty ships were imperfect by design. Their steel sometimes warped, their welds sometimes cracked, their engines sometimes failed. But they were built to fail and keep going. That was their genius. In one naval report, an American admiral summed it up. The Liberty ship is proof that quantity has a quality all its own. And he was right. By war's end, 2,710 Liberty ships had been completed. They carried 2/3 of all Allied cargo, over 120 million tons of supplies. Together they sailed 150 million miles, enough to circle the Earth 6,000 times. But numbers tell only half the story. The other half lives in memories. When the war ended, many of those ships were scrapped, sold, or abandoned. Some became civilian freighters, others floating storage, a few left to rust on forgotten shores. Yet a handful survived. In 1966, a historian found the SS Jeremiah O'Brien sitting idle in the San Francisco Bay, her decks covered in dust and seagull feathers. She was restored decades later, her engines cleaned, her hull repainted. When she sailed again in 1994 for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, veterans wept on her deck. The sound of her engine, the same deep, rhythmic thrum that had once crossed oceans, brought back everything: the fear, the pride, the unity. An old welder from Kaiser's yard stood by the rail that day. His hands shook, but his voice was steady. "They said we were wasting steel," he said. "Turns out we were forging history." That was the aftermath, not glory, not spectacle, but quiet endurance echoing across generations. The Liberty ship didn't just win a war. It redefined how wars were fought. It proved that strength could be assembled, that power could be multiplied, that courage could exist in repetition. Its story isn't one of heroism alone. It's a story of patience, of belief, of ordinary people making extraordinary things over and over until the impossible became normal. And in that simplicity lies its beauty. The war moved on, but the Liberty ships did not vanish. They simply faded into the background of peace, uncelebrated, unromantic, unthanked. After 1945, as soldiers returned home to parades and medals, the merchant sailors went back to their docks. There were no cheering crowds for them, no speeches, no songs. Many never even received veteran status. But they didn't ask for it. They knew what they had done. In the shipyards, the welding torches went dark. The cranes fell silent. Rust began to bloom on the rails where steel had once moved like blood through a living machine. Yet the ghosts of that rhythm remained, in every rivet, every dock, every man who remembered what it felt like to build something that could outlast fear. A young historian visiting the abandoned yards in Portland years later described the silence as the sound of victory after the noise is gone. He wasn't wrong, because the Liberty ship was never meant to be beautiful. It was meant to be unstoppable, and it was. Across the ocean, in the archives of Kiel, a faded document still bears the pencil marks of a German naval analyst from 1944. The words read simply, "We underestimated them. They do not stop." Those 4 words summarize the entire war better than any speech ever could. They do not stop. That was the spirit behind every Liberty ship launched, every welder who refused to rest, every sailor who crossed a blackened sea. The victory wasn't just industrial, it was psychological. It proved that freedom could be mechanized, that hope could be mass-produced, that an ordinary idea, multiplied enough times, could change the shape of the world. When the SS Jeremiah O'Brien steamed under the Golden Gate Bridge in 1994, her engines beating the same slow rhythm as half a century before, she carried not just her crew, but time itself. On her deck stood the children and grandchildren of those who had built her. Some wept, others just stood in silence. One man, a former riveter now in his 80s, placed his hand on the warm metal and whispered, "You carried the weight of the free world. Thank you." That moment, quiet, small, human, was the final line in the story of the Liberty Fleet. No monuments could ever capture what those ships meant. They were not about pride or power, but persistence. In their grey simplicity lay the blueprint for modern victory, the understanding that wars are not only fought by the brave, but by the consistent. They show that courage could be measured not in seconds of heroism, but in hours of labour. The Liberty ship was the heartbeat of a civilization learning to survive by endurance alone. And as the last surviving ships rest today in harbours and museums, their hulls whisper a lesson written in steel, that freedom like a ship does not stay afloat because it is flawless, but because people, against all odds, refuse to let it sink.